Thank you, Ian. It's great to be here. As a start, I want to start with an illustration. And I want to say that this forms the sort of bedrock of my whole talk this morning. So if you get bored, if you lose your way, just come back to this illustration and mull it over. So I want you to imagine that you're driving a big truck. It's a big HGV truck. You've got 10 tons of sort of material behind you. And you're heading down the road and everything's fine. But then you come to a river. And you come to the bridge. And there's a big sign by the bridge that says, "Caution, 1 ton limit." So what do? You've got 10 tons sitting behind you and a 1 ton limit. Now, as far as I can make out, you've only got 3 options. The first of which is to grip the steering wheel a bit tighter, offer a quick prayer, slam your foot down on the accelerator and go for it, and hope against hope that the bridge will take your weight. Or you can stop the truck, unload your load and take it across in smaller bits. Or you build a stronger bridge. And as far as I can work out, they're your only 3 options. And that is exactly the situation we find ourselves in as church. The church is this truck carrying a heavy load, a beautiful load, but a heavy load. The gospel message in all its mysteriousness, in all its beauty, in all its graces, all its joy, is actually a heavy message for our world. For it's a countercultural message. The world doesn't really know what to make of it, and it's challenging. Yet at the same time, it's liberating, but it's a heavy message. And the problem is, you see, I think as church, our tendency has been to grip the steering wheel, offer a quick prayer, because we never spend long on our knees in prayer. We offer a quick prayer and ram our foot on the accelerator and try and get everything across at once. And of course, we can all think of times, can't we? We can all think of times where the message has got across, where those isolated evangelistic moments have occurred, where the Spirit moves and someone falls on their knees and become a Christian. But we forget the hundreds of times where the bridge just collapses, where the message is too heavy for that person at that time. And I think if we want to reach the next generation, particularly young people, but actually I'm talking about everyone, if we want to reach our neighbours, our colleagues, our families, our friends, we've still only got those 3 options. And we've tried the first, and the bridge keeps collapsing. So I think we've either got to take the message across in smaller loads, or we've got to build a stronger relational bridge so that the relationship can take the load. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm not talking about changing the gospel message. You know, God is still God. Sin is still sin. Jesus is still born, and he still lived, and he still died, and he still rose again. I'm not talking about changing the message, but I am talking about changing the method. You know, last week, David shared with us, if you're watching online, you can always go back and rewatch it. Last week, David, pastor of the church, shared the beginning of this Building Bridges series for us. And it's talking about revealing truth on the front line. And he shared a message of rescue and of revelation and of reorientation. A big tick for David, because there were 3 R's there. That was good. But the truth is, our world and our society and our culture is not often in a place to readily receive that message. I'm going to talk for just a few moments about something that I call the rise of the nuns. You might have heard me speak on this because I speak on it a lot. I'm not talking about a freaky religious horror, okay? It's not nuns, N-U-N. It's nuns, N-O-N-E-S. I'd love to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to say that if you're really interested in it, get this book by James Emery White. It's a fantastic resource. But the truth is that in every census, in every survey, in every poll, the none of the above is rising exponentially. The truth is that when we talk about faith and religion, those that tick the none of the above box are huge in our society. Just taking you back, way back, some of you remember, back in 1940, it was only 4 or 5% of the population. Only 4 or 5% of the population ticked none of the above. 50 years later, in 1990, it was only about 8%. So in 50 years, it only shifted 3%. That's not that dramatic, really. By 2008, it was 15%, which of course is a rise, but again, you might be saying, well, there's still 85% who haven't ticked none of the above. But then it begins to shift. By 2012, we're at 20%. That's 1 in 5. By 2014, 2 years later, we're at 23%. Now, that book that I highlighted earlier was published in 2014. The latest figures, 2016, were about 26%. Just hold that thought for a second. That's over 1 in 4. Over 1 in 4 people are saying none of the above. And that's the best guess. They reckon that in the UK, we're going to be, well, we are already at 44%. And they reckon by the year 2021-22, we're going to be at about 50%. That's the best guess. It's the rate of change that's really astounding. You know, the nuns are now the largest religious group in the UK. And in the millennials, the 18 to 25 age group, it's even higher. It's no wonder that churches struggle for the 18 to 30s age group. You know, the largest religious group isn't Muslims, it's not Jedis, it's not Hindus, it's none of the above. Interestingly, it's not atheists. God is just seen as so irrelevant and so unnecessary. It's kind of a functional, soft atheism. It's like, I don't know enough to decide whether Christianity is untrue or not. Because whenever anyone's tried to share it with me, the message has been too big. And I haven't got it. It's like the bridge has collapsed. As churches, we're only just waking up to the possibility of work with millennials. But you know, actually it's Generation Z, the next generation down, the children of our church. That's why it's so good to hear stories of what you're doing with children. But the truth is most people don't have any longing. They don't have any spiritual memory that needs awakening. They don't have a Bible literacy. And if I were to quote Appetus, which is kind of a world-changing Twitter account, when they're asked about why they don't believe in God, they say this: the largest truth is it's years since I even cared. So if we want to bridge that gap, if we want to get across the river, the best way to do it is not by yelling even louder. The best way to do it is not by focusing on our needs. It's not by focusing on telling people that we've got the truth and they just need to hear it. We need to rapidly move from what I've called an Acts 2 method, where Peter preaches about 50 words and 3,000 people repent. We need to move from Acts 2 to Acts 17, where Paul stands at the altar to the unknown God. And in a pagan, pluralistic society, he rests his hand on the altar of the unknown God and says, would you like to know about that God? Would you like to know that God's name? And he takes them back to creation and tells them the story of God. You know, a few months ago, I was in a church where I'd taken a young person who'd never been to church before. And the vicar at the front said, we're now going to have a reading from John. And the young person turned to me and said, who's John and why is he reading to us? I've been in churches where somebody said, if you want to know more about our church, go and talk to Lucy. And anyone who's not of the church goes, who's Lucy? And then they never talk to them. I've read illustrations where they said, we're sharing the Lord's Supper next week. And somebody said, what food do I need to bring? You know, our world is so far removed from our church experience that they just don't get it. And we need to deconstruct everything we do. We need to re-explain the story of God afresh once again. I re-watched a 2013 movie, the movie Gravity. Some of you will have seen it with Sandra Bullock in it. There's a scene in the middle of that movie that haunts me still. And you can sense the fear and the anxiety and the loneliness in her voice, which maybe isn't too far removed from these COVID times. She might have been in space, but the feelings are the same. And she said these words when she realized how fearful and lonely she was. Take a look at this clip.
Ow! 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 Oh, I'm dying, honey. I know, we're all gonna die. Everybody knows that. But I'm gonna die today. Funny that, to know. But the thing is that I'm still scared. I'm really scared. Nobody will mourn for me. No one will pray for my soul. Will you mourn for me? Will you say a prayer for me? Or is it too late? I'd say one for myself, but I've never prayed in my life, so nobody ever taught me how. Nobody ever taught me how.
Picture that scene not in space, but in a care home or in a school, where she said, I'm scared, I'm lonely, I'm going to die, and I may die today. Will you pray for me? I'd pray for myself, but nobody taught me how. Nobody had explained what you need to do and what you need to say. Most of us, the truth is, we've been Christians for so long that we can't even remember what life was like before, when church didn't feel comfortable. We need to unload the lorry and we need to take it across in smaller, much more manageable loads, even going as far as to empty the boxes themselves. We need to work out afresh how we're going to share faith, how we're going to share the faith that we hold and hold together grace and truth as an intricate tightrope. Truth without grace is just judgment. And millennials and Generation Z, quite frankly, most people will just walk away because they've heard enough judgment from the church. But grace without truth is just license to do the same with a supposed affirming pat on the back from God. And that's not the gospel that Jesus died to bring. Holding grace and truth together is the biggest challenge we have of reaching the next generation. And holding grace and truth in biblical and cultural tension is the challenge of building bridges and revealing truth on the front line. As well as unloading the lorry, we could also build a stronger bridge, capable of holding that heavy load. But the deep down truth is that most of us in church don't have deep, abiding relationships with people outside the church. Ask yourself honestly this, whether you're here now or whether you're watching online, ask honestly, how many non-church going friends have you really got? And by friends, I mean people you'd go on holiday with, people you'd celebrate birthdays with, people you'd cry with when life got too much, people you'd trust the care of your children to. Not just Facebook contacts, but real friends. There's this quote, I don't know how true it is, but the quote is this: after being a Christian for 2 years, the average believer doesn't have a single significant relationship with a non-believer. If you haven't got 3, 4, 5 really deep, abiding, unchurched relationships, can I suggest that you drop a church activity, join a sports club, join a knitting group, whatever it is, and start making friends? Not to badger them to come to church, not so that you can ram the gospel across in one big heavy message, but just because they're made in the image of God and he loves them. So I've painted a bit of a picture, and I could go on all day. Perhaps it's a gloomy picture to some, but what about some solutions? Well, I want us to turn to a passage of the Bible in the book of Colossians chapter 4. And some of the answers are found in that passage. It's a passage written by a guy called Paul, who his life was transformed, really, by meeting Jesus. He moved from being an ardent opponent of Jesus to being the foremost advocate for the church. And he knew the struggle of bringing a message to a people who didn't believe and didn't care. So he wrote a letter to a small place called Colossae, which is found in modern-day Turkey. And it's a letter that speaks of God's authority and sovereignty and a call for Christians to live a life worthy of being called little Christs. And at the end of the letter, there's a passage which I'm going to quickly highlight some things from. The passage is this. And it starts, devote yourselves to prayer. It's good that it starts there. And it was great to hear David speak earlier in the service about your commitment to prayer. Because that's a sign of a healthy church, actually. But it's interesting, isn't it, through these COVID times, how much we've heard about the things we can't do. I've heard so much moaning about the fact that we can't meet together. We can't worship together. We can't sing songs together. We can't have tea and coffee together. I've heard precious little about what we can do. And one of the things we can do, and we've always been able to do, is to pray. You know, I wonder what would have happened to the worldwide church if we'd spent the last 6 months in prayer instead of moaning about not being able to hold a service? I wonder what resources from heaven would have been released then. I wonder what blessings we might actually be seeing now. So Paul starts, devote yourselves to prayer. Not just a quick, once a week in church because we have to, but devotion. And then he moves on, he says, be watchful and thankful. And when he says be watchful, he's not talking about being watchful for opportunities to ram the gospel home. He's saying to the people of Colossae, watch kind of with your heart, not just your physical eyes, but watch for the spiritual dynamics that are happening. Watch and maybe listen for promptings in your heart and the directing of God. All the time thanking God for what he is doing. Because God is doing stuff, even if it might not feel like it. He moves on, doesn't he? And he says, pray for us. Pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message. Remember always, church, it is God that does the work. He opens the door. For most of us, our call is not to be an evangelist. There is a specific gift of evangelism, and you know it if you've got it. But each and every one of us is called to be witnesses to what God has done for us. And not just a testimony of 30 years ago, but right here, right now, what is God doing in our lives? And the Holy Spirit opens that door for us to share that story. We may not be sharing the whole gospel message yet, but we can share a story of what God has done in our lives. When Paul said our message, he wasn't just referring to himself and his co-workers, Timothy, the professional Christians, the seasoned evangelists, the paid members of the church, the senior pastors. No, he wasn't just referring to them. He was referring to you and me. The message of salvation is yours and mine. And together we as a church, not just West Road Church, but all of the churches across Suffolk and the world, join together as we proclaim the mystery of Christ. Because it's a joint responsibility. Often when you do talk to people about how they came to become Christians, it wasn't just a one-off. It wasn't just a one-shot. There were lots of people involved. Lots of little stories, lots of little encounters, odd bits and pieces that slotted into place over several years. I love the fact that he says, open the door for us. And he says that while he's sitting in jail. He could have been praying that God released him from jail so that he could go out and proclaim the message. After all, he's the best evangelist there is. No, Paul didn't pray that. He said, I want God to open the door for all of us, where we are, with the people around us now. And he says, for which I'm in chains. And it's worth noting that Paul writes this when he's in prison for the first time. And he was in prison for proclaiming the gospel. Remember, our message and our faith has a cost to it. Maybe our culture will turn more and more favourably to Christ. Or maybe it will turn more and more antagonistic to Christ. Maybe in the future we might lose our jobs for what we believe. Or lose our family for what we believe. Do we hold on to this message through the chains, as Paul did? He asked them to proclaim it as clearly as he should. Our call to witness is not an excuse to ram home unintelligible messages of church religiosity. It's a prayer that there may be a light bulb of clarity that switches on in somebody's mind. And then for the last few verses, he encourages the hearers to move from talking to God to talking to people about God. And he says, be wise in the way that we act towards outsiders, making the most of every opportunity. Be wise in the way we act. I know a church, I won't mention its name, but just a few weeks ago, they were very diligent in all their COVID-30 rules. Only 30 people are allowed in the church, and they had their list. And 2 new people turned up at the door who'd never been to church before. And the welcomer at the door turned them away because their name wasn't on the list. Fortunately, 2 Christians in the church overheard the discussion and ran out to the car park and said, you can have our seats. It was a happy ending to that, really, but we should be wise in the way we act towards outsiders, making the most of every opportunity that we could have. Because the world is watching what we do and say right now as church. Do we really believe all we've been proclaiming? Is our conversation always full of grace and seasoned with salt? Pure, unadulterated, life-changing, shame-ridding grace is what we proclaim. And it's what we're going to celebrate in a few moments in communion. We celebrate God's grace to us. Each and every one of us is a sinner forgiven. It's grace that brought us here to this place. Interesting, when he says seasoned with salt, I love this. You know, salt isn't actually a flavouring at all. We think it is, but it's not. What salt really does, and does really well, is it draws out the flavours that are already there. That's what salt does. It draws out the flavours that are already around it. You know, this is still God's world, and there are still the fingerprints of God all over this world, even through COVID-19. Maybe our job is to season with salt and to draw out God's flavours that are already in the world. Hope, joy, peace, love, forgiveness. As I finish up, I want to take us back to truth on the front line. Some of you may remember the poignant moment in the life of Jesus where he's dragged in front of Pontius Pilate, the Roman leader, who flippantly asks him, "What is truth?" And the truth was standing right in front of him. Truth is not contained in a statement. It's not contained in a pithy, apologetic answer to a probing question. The truth and the answer to our witnessing dilemma is not in some great gospel illustration. The truth is found in a person, Jesus Christ. As he himself said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Real truth is permanent, it's fixed, and it's established. It's inflexible, it's unvarying, it's constant, it's lasting, it's enduring, it's timeless, it's unchanging. And because of that, truth will always be relevant. It will always be current. It will always be contemporary. And it will never be outdated, obsolete, or expired. Because truth never tires, truth never wanes, truth never ceases to be true. Our culture says there is no such thing as absolute truth. Truth is what you make of it. Truth is what you decide. Truth is what you want it to be. Culture defines truth very selfishly. It says it's all about you and only about you. And into all of that mess stands Jesus, who says, "I am the truth," who says it's about me and what I've come to bring. And that truth can act like a shining beacon to our world, to a world that at the moment is full of confusion and fear and anxiety, in a fog of despair. And it needs a shining beacon to lead them through. When Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except by me," it's not a pronouncement of judgment over the world. It's not hate speech. It's not cruel or bigoted. It's grace-filled truth. When he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," it's an invitation to the world to come home. And that's the message we proclaim. And that's why it's worth stopping the truck, unloading and emptying every last heavy box, and then spending every ounce of blood, sweat, and tears to build a stronger bridge, to offer an invitation to the world to come home. And as I end there, we're going to move into a time of communion together. Some of you watching online may be thinking, that's a strange segue, Matt. Some of you may be thinking, what on earth is communion? Communion is really an offer to the world to come home. When Jesus was having a meal with his friends, celebrating, he was celebrating and remembering when God said to his world, I love you. And I'm going to protect you. I'm going to keep you with me. And when the meal was ended, he stretched across, as I'm doing now, and he leant through the food and he grabbed some bread that was on the table. And he poured himself a cup of wine. These weren't magic implements. They were just ordinary bread and ordinary wine that was on the table. And you may have some with you right now, or you may be sitting at your kitchen table. Please feel free to go to your kitchen and grab some bread or a bread roll or whatever, and pour yourself some wine or some juice and do as Jesus did. And he said to his friends gathered around him, he said, I want you to remember and I want you to celebrate. And across the world, churches will be doing this right now. In different ways, in different forms, some more formally than others. But together, they sit with bread and they wine and they remember what Jesus did. When Jesus took up the bread, he broke it. And he said, whenever you come together, remember me, remember my body broken. And they ate together. Don't worry if you don't quite understand what's going on. I'm not sure all the disciples did. They certainly didn't kind of put the jigsaw pieces together till later. Don't worry if you're not yet quite a fully signed up, ardent follower of Christ. Around that table of the first communion was a disciple who would betray him. He said, remember me, remember my body broken, and remember the blood that is shed for you. Do this as often as you meet together. And in sharing bread and wine together, we remember that glorious, grace-filled message, that invitation for the world to come home.